Section 61 of Childhood's Favourites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ruth Golding. Childhood's Favourites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 61. Puss in Boots. Once upon a time there was a miller who was so poor that at his death he had nothing to leave to his 3 children but his mill, his ass, and his cat. The eldest son took the mill, and the second the ass, so there was nothing left for poor Jack but to take Puss. Jack could not help thinking that he had been treated shabbily. "My brothers will be able to earn an honest livelihood," he sighed. "But as for me, though Puss may feed himself by catching mice, I shall certainly die of hunger." The cat, who had overheard his young master, jumped upon his shoulder, and rubbing himself gently against his cheek, began to speak. "Dear master," said he, "do not grieve. I am not as useless as you think me, and will undertake to make your fortune for you, if only you will buy me a pair of boots, and give me that old bag." Now Jack had very little money to spare, but knowing Puss to be a faithful old friend, he made up his mind to trust him, and so spent all he possessed upon a smart pair of boots made of buff-coloured leather. They fitted perfectly, so Puss put them on, took the old bag which his master gave him, and trotted off to a neighbouring warren, in which he knew there was a great number of rabbits. Having put some bran and fresh parsley into the bag, he laid it upon the ground, hid himself, and waited. Presently 2 foolish little rabbits, sniffing the food, ran straight into the bag, when the clever cat drew the strings and caught them. Then, slinging the bag over his shoulder, he hastened off to the palace, where he asked to speak to the king. Having been shown into the royal presence, he bowed and said, "Sire, my lord the Marquis of Carabas has commanded me to present these rabbits to your majesty with his respects." The monarch, having desired his thanks to be given to the Marquis, who, as you will guess, was really our poor Jack, then ordered his head cook to dress the rabbits for dinner, and he and his daughter partook of them with great enjoyment. Day by day Puss brought home stores of good food, so that he and his master lived in plenty, and besides that he did not fail to keep the king and his courtiers well supplied with game. Sometimes he would lay a brace of partridges at the royal feet, sometimes a fine large hare. But whatever it was, it always came with the same message, from my lord the Marquis of Carabas, so that every one at court was talking of this strange nobleman, whom no one had ever seen, but who sent such generous presents to his majesty. At length Puss decided that it was time for his master to be introduced at court. So one day he persuaded him to go and bathe in a river near, having heard that the king would soon pass that way. Jack stood shivering up to his neck in water, wondering what was to happen next, when suddenly the king's carriage appeared in sight. At once Puss began to call out as loudly as he could, "Help! Help! My lord the Marquis of Carabas is drowning." The king put his head out of the carriage window, and recognizing the cat, ordered his attendants to go to the assistance of the Marquis. While Jack was being taken out of the water, Puss ran to the king and told him that some robbers had run off with his master's clothes whilst he was bathing, the truth of the matter being that the cunning cat had hidden them under a stone. On hearing this story, the king instantly dispatched one of his grooms to fetch a handsome suit of purple and gold from the royal wardrobe, and arrayed in this, Jack, who was a fine, handsome fellow, looked so well that no one for a moment supposed but that he was some noble foreign lord. The king and his daughter were so pleased with his appearance that they invited him into their carriage. At first Jack hesitated, for he felt a little shy about sitting next to a princess, but she smiled at him so sweetly, and was so kind and gentle, that he soon forgot his fears, and fell in love with her there and then. As soon as Puss had seen his master seated in the royal carriage, he whispered directions to the coachman, and then ran on ahead as fast as he could trot, until he came to a field of corn where the reapers were busy.
"Reapers," said he fiercely, "the king will shortly pass this way. If he should ask you to whom this field belongs, remember that you say, 'To the Marquis of Carabas.' If you dare to disobey me, I will have you all chopped up as fine as mincemeat."
The reapers were so afraid the cat would keep his word that they promised to obey. Puss then ran on and told all the other labourers whom he met to give the same answer, threatening them with terrible punishments if they disobeyed. Now the king was in a very good humour, for the day was fine, and he found the Marquis a very pleasant companion. So he told the coachman to drive slowly, in order that he might admire the beautiful country. "What a fine field of wheat!" he said presently. "To whom does it belong?" Then the men answered as they had been told, "To our lord the Marquis of Carabas." Next they met a herd of cattle, and again to the king's question, "To whom do they belong?" they were told, "To the Marquis of Carabas." And it was the same with everything they passed. The Marquis listened with the greatest astonishment, and thought what a very wonderful cat his dear Puss was. And the king was delighted to find that his new friend was as wealthy as he was charming. Meanwhile, Puss, who was well in advance of the royal party, had arrived at a stately castle, which belonged to a cruel ogre, the richest ever known, for all the lands the king had admired so much belonged to him. Puss knocked at the door and asked to see the ogre, who received him quite civilly, for he had never seen a cat in boots before, and the sight amused him. So he and Puss were soon chatting away together. The ogre, who was very conceited, began to boast of what clever tricks he could play, and Puss sat and listened with a smile on his face.
"I once heard, great ogre," he said at last, "that you possessed the power of changing yourself into any kind of animal you chose. A lion, or an elephant, for instance."
"Well, so I can," replied the ogre.
"Dear me, how much I should like to see you do it now," said Puss sweetly. The ogre was only too pleased to find a chance of showing how very clever he was, so he promised to transform himself into any animal Puss might mention. "Oh, I will leave the choice to you," said the cat politely.
Immediately there appeared where the ogre had been seated an enormous lion, roaring and lashing with its tail, and looking as though it meant to gobble the cat up in a trice. Puss was really very much frightened, and jumping out of the window, managed to scramble on to the roof, though he could scarcely hold on to the tiles on account of his high-heeled boots. There he sat, refusing to come down, until the ogre changed himself into his natural form, and laughingly called to him that he would not hurt him. Then Puss ventured back into the room, and began to compliment the ogre on his cleverness.
"Of course, it was all very wonderful," he said, "but it would be more wonderful still if you, who are so great and fierce, could transform yourself into some timid little creature, such as a mouse. That, I suppose, would be quite impossible."
"Not at all," said the vain ogre. "One is quite as easy to me as the other, as I will show you."
And in a moment a little brown mouse was frisking about all over the floor, whilst the ogre had vanished.
"Now or never," said Puss,
and with a spring he seized the mouse and gobbled it up as fast as he could. At the same moment all the gentlemen and ladies whom the wicked ogre had held in his castle under a spell became disenchanted. They were so grateful to their deliverer that they would have done anything to please him, and readily agreed to enter into the service of the Marquis of Carabas when Puss asked them to do so. So now the cat had a splendid castle, which he knew to be full of heaped-up treasures, at his command, and ordering a magnificent feast to be prepared, he took up his station at the castle gates to welcome his master and the royal party. As soon as the castle appeared in sight, the king inquired whose it was.
"For," said he, "I have never seen a finer."
Then Puss, bowing low, threw open the castle gates and cried,
"May it please your Majesty to alight and enter the home of the most noble, the Marquis of Carabas."
Full of surprise, the king turned to the Marquis.
"Is this splendid castle indeed yours?" he asked. "Not even our own palace is more beautiful, and doubtless it is as splendid within as without."
Puss then helped his Majesty to alight, and conducted him into the castle, where a group of noble gentlemen and fair ladies were waiting to receive them. Jack, or the Marquis as he was now called, gave his hand to the young princess, and led her to the banquet. Long and merrily they feasted, and when at length the guests rose to depart, the king embraced the Marquis, and called him his dear son, and the princess blushed so charmingly, and looked so shy and sweet, that Jack ventured to lay his heart and fortune at her feet. And so the miller's son married the king's daughter, and there were great rejoicings throughout the land. On the evening of the wedding day a great ball was given, to which princes and noblemen from far and near were invited. Puss opened the ball, wearing for the occasion a pair of boots made of the finest leather, with gold tassels and scarlet heels. I only wish you could have seen him. When the old king died, the princess and her husband reigned in his stead, and their most honoured and faithful friend at court was Puss himself, for his master never forgot to whom he owed all his good fortune. He lived upon the daintiest meat and most delicious cream, and was petted and made much of all the days of his life, and never again ran after mice and rats, except for exercise and amusement. End of section 61. Recording by Ruth Golding. Section 62 of Childhood's Favourites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ruth Golding. Childhood's Favourites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 62. The Elves and the Shoemaker. There was once a shoemaker who, through no fault of his own, had become so poor that at last he had only leather enough left for one pair of shoes. At evening he cut out the shoes, which he intended to begin upon the next morning, and since he had a good conscience, he lay down quietly, said his prayers, and fell asleep. In the morning, when he had prayed as usual, and was preparing to sit down to work, he found the pair of shoes standing finished on his table. He was amazed, and could not understand it in the least. He took the shoes in his hand to examine them more closely. They were so neatly sewn that not a stitch was out of place, and were as good as the work of a master hand. Soon after, a purchaser came in, and as he was much pleased with the shoes, he paid more than the ordinary price for them, so that the shoemaker was able to buy leather for 2 pairs with the money. He cut them out in the evening, and next day, with fresh courage, was about to go to work. But he had no need to, for when he got up, the shoes were finished, and buyers were not lacking. These gave him so much money that he was able to buy leather for 4 pairs of shoes. Early next morning he found the 4 pairs finished, and so it went on. What he cut out at evening was finished in the morning, so that he was soon again in comfortable circumstances, and became a well-to-do man. Now it happened one evening, not long before Christmas, when he had cut out shoes as usual, that he said to his wife, "How would it be if we were to sit up tonight to see who it is that lends us such a helping hand?" The wife agreed, lighted a candle, and they hid themselves in the corner of the room, behind the clothes which were hanging there. At midnight came 2 little naked men, who sat down at the shoemaker's table, took up the cut-out work, and began with their tiny fingers to stitch, sew, and hammer so neatly and quickly that the shoemaker could not believe his eyes. They did not stop till everything was quite finished and stood complete on the table. Then they ran swiftly away. The next day the wife said, "The little men have made us rich, and we ought to show our gratitude. They run about with nothing on, and must freeze with cold. Now I will make them little shirts, coats, waistcoats, and hose, and will even knit them stout stockings, and you shall make them each a pair of shoes." The husband agreed, and at evening, when they had everything ready, they laid out the presents on the table, and hid themselves to see how the little men would behave. At midnight they came skipping in, and were about to set to work. But instead of the leather ready cut out, they found the charming little clothes. At first they were surprised, then excessively delighted. With the greatest speed they put on and smoothed down the pretty clothes, singing,
"Now we're dressed so fine and neat, why cobble more for others' feet?"
Then they hopped and danced about, and leapt over chairs and tables, and out at the door. Henceforward they came back no more, but the shoemaker fared well as long as he lived, and had good luck in all his undertakings. End of section 62. Recording by Ruth Golding.
Section 63 of Childhood Favorites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ralph Snelson. Childhood Favorites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 63. Hans in Luck. Hans had served his master 7 long years, so he said to him, "Master, my time is out, and my wish is to return home to my mother. Give me, if you please, my reward." The master answered, "Thou hast truly and faithfully served me. As the service was, so shall the reward be." And he gave Hans a piece of gold as big as his head. Hans pulled out his handkerchief, wrapped up the lump of gold in it, and throwing it over his shoulder, made his way home. As he went on his way, always putting one foot before the other, he met a man galloping briskly along on a fine horse. "Ah," said Hans, quite aloud, "what a capital thing it is to ride! There you sit as comfortably as in a chair, kicking against no stones, saving your shoe leather, and getting to your journey's end almost without knowing it." The horseman, who heard this, pulled up and cried, "Hello, Hans, why do you trudge on foot?" "Because I must," answered he, "for I have this big lump to carry home. It is real gold, you know, but all the same I can scarcely hold up my head, it weighs so terribly on my shoulders." "I'll tell you what," said the horseman, "we'll just exchange. I'll give you my horse, and you give me your lump of gold." "With all my heart," said Hans, "but I warn you, you'll have a job to carry it." The horseman dismounted, took the gold, and helped Hans up, and giving the bridle into his hand, said, "If you want him to go at full speed, you must cluck your tongue and cry, 'Tsk!'" Hans was heartily delighted as he sat on his horse and rode gaily along. After a while he fancied he would like to go faster, so he began to cluck with his tongue and cry, "Tsk!" The horse broke into a smart trot, and before Hans was aware, he was thrown off, splash, into a ditch which divided the highway from the fields, and there he lay. The horse, too, would have run away had it not been stopped by a peasant as he came along the road driving his cow before him. Hans pulled himself together and got upon his legs again. He felt very downcast, and said to the peasant, "It's a poor joke, that riding, especially when one lights upon such a brute as this, which kicks and throws one off so that one comes near to breaking one's neck. You don't catch me on his back again. Now there's more sense in a cow like yours, behind which you can walk in peace and quietness, besides having your butter, milk, and cheese every morning for certain. What I would not give for such a cow." "Well," said the peasant, "if it would give you so much pleasure, I will exchange my cow for your horse." Hans gladly consented, and the peasant flung himself on the horse and rode quickly off. Hans drove the cow peacefully along, thinking, "What a lucky fellow I am! I have just to get a bit of bread, and that isn't a difficult matter, and then, as often as I like, I can eat my butter and cheese with it. If I'm thirsty, I just milk my cow and drink. What more could I desire?" When he came to an inn, he made a stop, and in his great joy ate all the food he had with him, right up, both dinner and supper. With his 2 last farthings he bought himself half a glass of beer. Then he drove his cow towards his mother's village. As the morning went on, the more oppressive the heat became, and Hans found himself in a field some 3 miles long. Then he felt so hot that his tongue was parched with thirst. "This is soon cured," thought Hans. "I've only to milk my cow, drink, and refresh myself." He tied the cow to a withered tree, and as he had no pitcher, he placed his leathern cap underneath her. But in spite of all his trouble, not a drop of milk could be got. And he went to work so clumsily that the impatient brute gave him such a kick with her hind leg that he was knocked over and quite dazed, and for a long time did not know where he was. Luckily, a butcher came by just then, wheeling a young pig in a barrow. "What kind of a joke is this?" cried he, helping our friend Hans to rise. Hans told him what had happened. The butcher passed him his bottle and said, "There, drink and revive yourself. That cow will never give any milk. She is an old animal, and at the best is only fit for the plough or the butcher." "Oh," said Hans, running his fingers through his hair. "Who would have thought it? It is all right indeed when you can slaughter such a beast in your own house, but I don't think much of cow's flesh. It is not tender enough. Now if one had a young pig, that would taste far different, to say nothing of the sausages." "Listen, Hans," said the butcher. "For your sake I will exchange and let you have my pig for your cow." "May Heaven reward your friendship," said Hans, and at once gave him the cow. The man untied the pig from the wheelbarrow, and gave the rope with which it was bound into Hans' hand. Hans marched on, thinking, "What a lucky fellow I am! As soon as anything goes wrong, something turns up, and all's right again." Just then up came a youth carrying a fine white goose under his arm. They were friends, and Hans began to talk about his luck, and how he always came off best in his exchanges. The youth told him he was taking the goose to a christening feast. "Just hold it," he continued, seizing it by the wings, "and feel how heavy it is. Yet it was only fattened for 8 weeks. It will be a rich morsel when roasted." "Yes," said Hans, weighing it with his hand, "it is certainly heavy, but my pig is by no means to be despised." Meanwhile the lad was looking thoughtfully around, shaking his head. "Listen," he said, "I don't think it's all right about your pig. In the village I have just come through, one has lately been stolen from the magistrate's own sty. I fear it is the one you have. They have sent people out, and it would be a bad business if they found you with the pig. The least they would do would be to throw you into jail." Our friend Hans was downcast. "Alas," he cried, "help me in my need. You know your way here better than I. Take my pig then, and give me your goose." "I shall be running great risks," said the youth, "but at least I will prevent your getting into trouble." He took the rope in his hand and drove the pig quickly away down a bypath, and Hans went on relieved of his sorrow, towards home with the goose under his arm. "What a lucky fellow I am," he said to himself. "First I shall have a good roast, then there is the quantity of dripping that will fall out, which will keep me in bread and dripping for a quarter of a year, and lastly the splendid white feathers with which I will have my pillow stuffed. Then I shall fall asleep without rocking. How glad my mother will be!" When he was at length come to the village, there stood in the street a scissors grinder with his truck. His wheel hummed, and he sang the while: "My wheel I turn and the scissors I grind, my cloak hangs flowing free in the wind." Hans remained standing and watched him. At length he spoke to him and said, "You must be doing well, since you are so merry over your grinding." "Yes," said the scissors grinder, "the work has gold at the bottom of it. A proper scissors grinder is the sort of man who, whenever he puts his hand in his pocket, finds money there. But where have you bought that fine goose?" "I did not buy it, but exchanged it for my pig." "And the pig?" "I obtained him for a cow." "And the cow?" "I had her for a horse." "And the horse?" "For him I gave a lump of gold as big as my head." "And the gold?" "Why, that was my reward for 7 years of service." "You have certainly done well for yourself each time," said the scissors grinder. "If you could only hear money rattling in your pocket every time you got up, your fortune would be made." "How shall I set about it?" said Hans. "You must become a grinder like me. All you want is a grindstone. The rest comes of itself. I have one which is a little damaged indeed, but for which I would ask nothing more than your goose. Would that suit you?" "How can you ask me?" answered Hans. "I shall be the luckiest fellow on earth. If I have money as often as I feel in my pocket, what else shall I have to care about? and he handed over the goose and took the grindstone in receipt. "Now," said the grinder, lifting up an ordinary heavy field stone which lay beside him, "there you have a capital stone, which will be just the thing to hammer your old nails straight upon. Take it and lift it up carefully." Hans raised the stone and marched on with a joyful heart, his eyes shining with pleasure. "I must have been born lucky," he cried out. "All that I desire comes to me, as to a Sunday child." Meanwhile, having been on his legs since daybreak, he began to feel tired, besides which he was tormented by hunger, for he had eaten up all his provision in his joy over the exchange of the cow. At length he could only proceed with great trouble, and must needs stop every minute. The stones, too, crushed him terribly. Then he could not conceal the thought, "How nice it would be now to have nothing to carry." Like a snail, he crept up to a well, wishing to rest himself and enjoy a refreshing drink. In order not to spoil the stones in setting them down, he laid them carefully on the ground, one beside the other, and bent himself down to drink. But by an accident he gave them a little push, and both stones went splashing down. Hans, when he saw them sinking in the depths of the well, jumped up with joy, kneeled down and thanked God with tears in his eyes that he had shown him this grace, and without troubling him to think what to do with them, had relieved him of the heavy stones which would have been such a hindrance to him. "There is no man under the sun," he cried out, "so lucky as I." With a bright heart and free from all care, he sprang upon his way until he was home at his mother's. End of section 63.
Section 64 of Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Clarica. Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 64. Master of All Masters. A girl once went to the fair to hire herself for a servant. At last a funny-looking old gentleman engaged her, and took her home to his house. When she got there, he told her that he had something to teach her, for that in his house he had his own names for things. He said to her, "What will you call me?" "Master, or Mister, or whatever you please, sir," says she. He said, "You must call me Master of All Masters. And what would you call this?" pointing to his bed. "Bed or couch, or whatever you please, sir." "No, that's my barnacle." "And what do you call these?" said he, pointing to his pantaloons. "Breeches or trousers, or whatever you please, sir." "You must call them squibs and crackers." "And what would you call her?" pointing to the cat. "Cat or kit, or whatever you please, sir." "You must call her white-faced Simony." "And this now," showing the fire, "what would you call this?" "Fire or flame, or whatever you please, sir." "You must call it hot cockalorum." "And what this?" he went on, pointing to the water. "Water or wet, or whatever you please, sir." "No, Pondalorum is its name." "And what do you call all this?" asked he, as he pointed to the house. "House or cottage, or whatever you please, sir." "You must call it High Topper Mountain." That very night the servant woke her master up in a fright, and said, "Master of all masters, get out of your barnacle and put on your squibs and crackers, for white-faced Simony has got a spark of hot cockalorum on its tail, and unless you get some Pondalorum, High Topper Mountain will be all on hot cockalorum." That's all. End of section 64.
Section 65 of Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Section 65. Belling the Cat. Once upon a time, the mice sat in council and talked of how they might outwit their enemy, the cat. But good advice was scarce, and in vain the president called upon all the most experienced mice present to find a way. At last, a very young mouse held up 2 fingers and asked to be allowed to speak. And as soon as he could get permission, he said, "I've been thinking for a long time why the cat is such a dangerous enemy. Now it's not so much because of her quickness, though people make so much fuss about that. If we could only notice her in time, I've no doubt we're nimble enough to jump into our holes before she could do us any harm. It's in her velvet paws. There's where she hides her cruel claws. Till she gets us in her clutches, that's where her power lies. With those paws she can tread so lightly that we can't hear her coming. And so, while we are still dancing heedlessly about the place, she creeps so close. And before we know where we are, she pounces down on us and has us in her clutches. Well then, it's my opinion we ought to hang a bell around her neck to warn us of her coming, while there's yet time." Everyone applauded the proposal, and the council decided that it should be carried out. Now the question was to be settled: who should undertake to fasten the bell around the cat's neck? The president declared that no one could be better fitted for the task than he who had given such excellent advice. But at that the young mouse became quite confused and stammered an excuse. He was too young for the deed, he said. He didn't know the cat well enough. His grandfather, who knew her better, would be more suited to the job. But the grandfather declared that just because he knew the cat very well, he would take good care not to attempt such a task. And the long and the short of it was that no other mouse would undertake the duty, and so this clever proposal was never carried out, and the cat remained mistress of the situation. End of Section 65, Belling the Cat.
Section 66 of Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Stearns. Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 66. Little Red Riding Hood. In a great wide forest, full of beautiful trees, and green glades, and thorny thickets, there lived, a long time ago, a woodcutter and his wife, who had only one child, a little girl. She was so pretty and so good that the sun seemed to shine more brightly when its light fell upon her rosy little face, and the birds would seem to sing more sweetly when she was passing by. Her real name was Maisie, but the neighbors round about all called her Little Red Riding Hood, because of a scarlet riding hood and cloak that her kind old grandmother had made for her, and which she nearly always wore. She was a happy, merry little child, with a smile and a gentle word for everybody, and so you may easily believe that everybody loved her, and was glad to catch a glimpse of her golden curls and her scarlet cloak as she tripped along, singing under the green boughs. Now this, let me tell you before I forget, was at the time when all the birds and beasts, or very nearly all, could speak just as well as you or I, and nobody was surprised to hear them talk, as I suppose one would be nowadays. Well, as I was saying, Little Red Riding Hood lived with her parents in a little white cottage with a green door and a thatched roof, and red and white roses climbing all over the walls, and even putting their pretty heads in the lattice windows to peep at the child who was so like them. It was on a bright spring morning, early in May, when Little Red Riding Hood had just finished putting away the breakfast cups that her mother came bustling in from the dairy. "Here's a to-do," she said. "Farmer Hodge has this very minute told me that he hears your granny isn't quite well, and I can't leave the cheese-making this morning for love or money. Do you go, my dear, and find out how she is, and, stay, take her this little pot of sweet fresh butter, and these 2 new-laid eggs, and these nice tasty pasties. Maybe they'll tempt her to eat a bit. Here's your basket, and don't be too long away, honey." So Little Red Riding Hood pulled her cloak over her curls, and set off down the sunny green slope, with her basket in her hand, at a brisk pace. But as she got deeper into the forest, she walked more slowly. Everything was so beautiful. The great trees waved their huge arms over her. The birds were calling to one another from the thorns, all white with blossom, and the child began singing as she went. She could not have told why, but I think it was because the beautiful world made her feel glad. The path wound along through the trees, and as it grew wider after turning a corner, Red Riding Hood saw that she was likely to have company on her walk. For where 2 cross paths divided, there sat a big gray wolf, licking his long paws, and looking sharply about him. And, "Good morning, Red Riding Hood," said he. "Good morning, Mr. Wolf," she answered. "And where may you be going, sweet lass?" said the wolf as he walked beside her. "Oh, Granny isn't very well, and Mother cannot leave the cheese-making this morning, and so I'm taking her some little dainties in my basket, and I am to see how she is, and tell Mother when I get back," said the child with a smile. "And," said the wolf, "where does your Granny live, little lady?" "Through the copse, and down the hollow, and over the bridge, and 3 meadows after the mill." "Does she indeed?" cried he. "Why, then, I do believe she's a very dear old friend of mine, whom I have not seen for years and years. Now, I'll tell you what I'll do, you and I. I will go by this way, and you shall take that, and whoever gets there first shall be the winner of the game." So the wolf trotted off one way, and Red Riding Hood went the other, and I am sorry to say that she lingered and loitered more than she ought to have done on the road. Well, what with one thing and another, the sun was right up in the very middle of the sky, when she crossed the last meadow from the mill and came in sight of her grandmother's cottage, and the big lilac bushes that grew by the garden gate. "Oh, dear, how I must have lingered!" said the child, when she saw how high the sun had climbed since she set out on her journey. And pattering up the garden path, she tapped at the cottage door. "Who's there?" said a very gruff kind of voice from inside. "It's only I, Granny dear, your little Red Riding Hood, with some goodies for you in my basket," answered the child. "Then pull the bobbin," cried the voice, "and the latch will go up." What a dreadful cold poor Granny must have, to be sure, to make her so hoarse, thought the child. Then she pulled the bobbin, and the latch went up, and Red Riding Hood pushed open the door and stepped inside the cottage. It seemed very dark in there after the bright sunlight outside, and all Red Riding Hood could see was that the window curtains and the bed curtains were still drawn, and her grandmother seemed to be lying in bed with the bedclothes pulled almost over her head, and her great white frilled nightcap nearly hiding her face. Now you and I have guessed by this time, although poor Red Riding Hood never even thought of such a thing, that it was not her Granny at all, but the wicked wolf, who had hurried to the cottage and put on Granny's nightcap and popped into her bed, to pretend that he was Granny herself. And where was Granny all this time, you will say? Well, we shall see presently. "Come, sit down beside me, dearie," wheezed the wolf, "and let us have a little chat." Then the wolf stretched out his large hairy paws and began to unfasten the basket. "Oh," said Red Riding Hood, "what great arms you have, Granny!" "All the better to hug you with," said the wolf. "And what great rough ears you have, Granny!" "All the better to hear you with, my little dear." "And your eyes, Granny, what great yellow eyes you have!" "All the better to see you with, my pet," grinned the wolf. "And oh, oh, Granny," cried the child in a sad fright, "what sharp teeth you have!" "All the better to eat you with," growled the wolf, springing up suddenly at Red Riding Hood. But just at that very moment the door flew open, and 2 tall woodcutters rushed in with their heavy axes, and killed the wicked wolf in far less time than it takes me to tell you about it. "But where is Granny?" asked Little Red Riding Hood, when she had thanked the brave woodcutters. "Oh, where can my poor Granny be? Can the cruel wolf have eaten her up?" And she began to cry and sob bitterly, when who should walk in but Granny herself, as large as life, and as hearty as ever, with her marketing basket on her arm. For it was another old dame in the village who was not very well, and Granny had been down to visit her and give her some of her famous herb tea. So everything turned out right in the end, and all lived happily ever after. But I promise you that Little Red Riding Hood never made friends with the wolf again. End of section 66. Recording by Jennifer Stearns, Concord, New Hampshire.
Section 67 of Childhood's Favourites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christine Blashford. Childhood's Favourites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 67. The Nail. A tradesman had once transacted a good day's business at a fair, disposed of all his goods, and filled his purse with gold and silver. He prepared afterward to return, in order to reach home by the evening, so he strapped his portmanteau with the money in it upon his horse's back, and rode off. At noon he halted in a small town, and as he was about to set out again, the stable-boy who brought his horse said to him, "Sir, a nail is wanting in the shoe on the left hind foot of your animal." "Let it be wanting," replied the tradesman. "I am in a hurry, and the iron will doubtless hold the 6 hours I have yet to travel." Late in the afternoon he had to dismount again, and feed his horse, and at this place also the boy came and told him that a nail was wanting in one of the shoes, and asked him whether he should take the horse to a farrier. "No, no, let it be," replied the master. "It will last out the couple of hours that I have now to travel. I am in haste." So saying he rode off, but his horse soon began to limp, and from limping it came to stumbling, and presently the beast fell down and broke its leg. Thereupon the tradesman had to leave his unfortunate horse lying on the road, to unbuckle the portmanteau, and to walk home with it upon his shoulder, where he arrived at last late at night. And all this misfortune, said he to himself, is owing to the want of a nail. More haste, the less speed. End of section 67. Section 68 of Childhood's Favourites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christine Blashford. Childhood's Favourites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 68. Jack and the Beanstalk. Once upon a time there lived a poor widow who had an only son named Jack. She was very poor, for times had been hard, and Jack was too young to work. Almost all the furniture of the little cottage had been sold to buy bread, until at last there was nothing left worth selling. Only the good cow, Milky White, remained, and she gave milk every morning, which they took to market and sold. But one sad day Milky White gave no milk, and then things looked bad indeed. "Never mind, mother," said Jack, "we must sell Milky White. Trust me to make a good bargain." And away he went to the market. For some time he went along very sadly, but after a little he quite recovered his spirits. "I may as well ride as walk," said he, so instead of leading the cow by the halter, he jumped on her back, and so he went whistling along until he met a butcher. "Good morning," said the butcher. "Good morning, sir," answered Jack. "Where are you going?" said the butcher. "I am going to market to sell the cow." "It's lucky I met you," said the butcher. "You may save yourself the trouble of going so far." With this he put his hand in his pocket and pulled out 5 curious-looking beans. "What do you call these?" he said. "Beans," said Jack. "Yes," said he, "beans, but they're the most wonderful beans that ever were known. If you plant them overnight, by the next morning they'll grow up and reach the sky. But to save you the trouble of going all the way to market, I don't mind exchanging them for that cow of yours." "Done," cried Jack, who was so delighted with the bargain that he ran all the way home to tell his mother how lucky he had been. But oh, how disappointed the poor widow was. "Off to bed with you," she cried, and she was so angry that she threw the beans out of the window into the garden. so poor Jack went to bed without any supper and cried himself to sleep. When he woke up the next morning, the room was almost dark, and Jack jumped out of bed and ran to the window to see what the matter was. The sun was shining brightly outside, but from the ground right up beside his window there was growing a great beanstalk, which stretched up and up as far as he could see into the sky. "I'll just see where it leads to," thought Jack, and with that he stepped out of the window onto the beanstalk and began to climb upwards. He climbed up and up, till after a time his mother's cottage looked a mere speck below. But at last the stalk ended, and he found himself in a new and beautiful country. A little way off there was a great castle, with a broad road leading straight up to the front gate. But what most surprised Jack was to find a beautiful maiden suddenly standing beside him. "Good morning, ma'am," said he very politely. "Good morning, Jack," said she, and Jack was more surprised than ever, for he could not imagine how she had learned his name. But he soon found that she knew a great deal more about him than his name, for she told him how, when he was quite a little baby, his father, a gallant knight, had been slain by the giant who lived in yonder castle, and how his mother, in order to save Jack, had been obliged to promise never to tell the secret. "All that the giant has is yours," she said, and then disappeared quite as suddenly as she came. "She must be a fairy," thought Jack. As he drew near to the castle, he saw the giant's wife standing at the door. "If you please, ma'am," said he, "would you kindly give me some breakfast? I have had nothing to eat since yesterday." Now the giant's wife, although very big and very ugly, had a kind heart, so she said, "Very well, little man, come in, but you must be quick about it, for if my husband, the giant, finds you here, he will eat you up, bones and all." So in Jack went, and the giant's wife gave him a good breakfast, but before he had half finished it, there came a terrible knock at the front door, which seemed to shake even the thick walls of the castle. "Dearie me, that is my husband," said the giantess in a terrible fright. "We must hide you somehow," and she lifted Jack up and popped him into the empty kettle. No sooner had the giant's wife opened the door than her husband roared out, "Fee, fi, fo, fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman. Be he alive or be he dead, I'll grind his bones to make my bread." "It's a boy, I'm sure it is," he continued. "Where is he? I'll have him for my breakfast." "Nonsense," said his wife, "you must be mistaken. It's the ox's hide you smell." So he sat down and ate up the greater part of the ox. When he had finished, he said, "Wife, bring me my money bags." So his wife brought him 2 full bags of gold, and the giant began to count his money. But he was so sleepy that his head soon began to nod, and then he began to snore like the rumbling of thunder. Then Jack crept out, snatched up the 2 bags, and though the giant's dog barked loudly, he made his way down the beanstalk back to the cottage before the giant awoke. Jack and his mother were now quite rich, but it occurred to him one day that he would like to see how matters were going on at the giant's castle. So while his mother was away at market, he climbed up and up and up and up until he got to the top of the beanstalk again. The giantess was standing at the door, just as before, but she did not know Jack, who, of course, was more finely dressed than on his first visit. "If you please, ma'am," said he, "will you give me some breakfast?" "Run away," said she, "or my husband, the giant, will eat you up, bones and all. The last boy who came here stole 2 bags of gold. Off with you." But the giantess had a kind heart, and after a time she allowed Jack to come into the kitchen, where she set before him enough breakfast to last him a week. Scarcely had he begun to eat than there was a great rumbling like an earthquake, and the giantess had only time to bundle Jack into the oven when in came the giant. No sooner was he inside the room than he roared, "Fee, fi, fo, fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman. Be he alive or be he dead, I'll grind his bones to make my bread." But his wife told him he was mistaken, and after breakfasting off a roasted bullock, just as if it were a lark, he called out, "Wife, bring the little brown hen." The giantess went out and brought in a little brown hen, which she placed on the table. "Lay," said the giant, and the hen at once laid a golden egg. "Lay," said the giant a second time, and she laid another golden egg. "Lay," said the giant a third time, and she laid a third golden egg. "That will do for today," said he, and stretched himself out to go to sleep. As soon as he began to snore, Jack crept out of the oven, went on tiptoe to the table, and snatching up the little brown hen, made a dash for the door. Then the hen began to cackle, and the giant began to wake up, but before he was quite awake Jack had escaped from the castle, and climbing as fast as he could down the beanstalk, got safe home to his mother's cottage. The little brown hen laid so many golden eggs that Jack and his mother had now more money than they could spend. But Jack was always thinking about the beanstalk, and one day he crept out of the window again and climbed up and up and up and up until he reached the top.
This time you may be sure he was careful not to be seen, so he crept round to the back of the castle, and when the giant's wife went out he slipped into the kitchen and hid himself in the oven. In came the giant, roaring louder than ever. "Fee, fi, fo, fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman. Be he alive or be he dead, I'll grind his bones to make my bread." But the giantess was quite sure that she had seen no little boys that morning, and after grumbling a great deal, the giant sat down to breakfast. Even then he was not quite satisfied, for every now and again he would say, "Fee, fi, fo, fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman." And once he got up and looked in the kettle, but of course Jack was in the oven all the time. When the giant had finished, he called out, "Wife, bring me the golden harp." So she brought in the golden harp and placed it on the table. "Sing," said the giant, and the harp at once began to sing the most beautiful songs that ever were heard. It sang so sweetly that the giant soon fell fast asleep, and then Jack crept quietly out of the oven, and going on tiptoe to the table, seized hold of the golden harp. But the harp at once called out, "Master, master!" and the giant woke up just in time to catch sight of Jack running out of the kitchen door. With a fearful roar he seized his oak tree club and dashed after Jack, who held the harp tight and ran faster than he had ever run before. The giant, brandishing his club and taking terribly long strides, gained on Jack at every instant, and he would have been caught if the giant hadn't slipped over a boulder. Before he could pick himself up, Jack began to climb down the beanstalk, and when the giant arrived at the edge, he was nearly halfway to the cottage. The giant began to climb down too, but as soon as Jack saw him coming, he called out, "Mother, bring me an axe!" And the widow hurried out with a chopper. Jack had no sooner reached the ground than he cut the beanstalk right in two. Down came the giant with a terrible crash, and that, you may be sure, was the end of him. What became of the giantess and the castle nobody knows, but Jack and his mother grew very rich and lived happily ever after. End of chapter 68. Section 69 of Childhood's Favourites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christine Blashford. Childhood's Favourites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 69. How to Tell a True Princess. There was once upon a time a prince who wanted to marry a princess, but she must be a true princess. So he travelled through the whole world to find one, but there was always something against each. There were plenty of princesses, but he could not find out if they were true princesses. In every case there was some little defect which showed the genuine article was not yet found. So he came home again in very low spirits, for he had wanted very much to have a true princess. One night there was a dreadful storm. It thundered and lightened, and the rain streamed down in torrents. It was fearful. There was a knocking heard at the palace gate, and the old king went to open it. There stood a princess outside the gate, but oh, in what a sad plight she was from the rain and the storm. The water was running down from her hair and her dress into the points of her shoes and out at the heels again, and yet she said she was a true princess. Well, we shall soon find out, thought the old queen, but she said nothing and went into the sleeping room, took off all the bedclothes and laid a pea on the bottom of the bed. Then she put 20 mattresses on top of the pea and 20 eider-down quilts on top of the mattresses, and this was the bed in which the princess was to sleep. The next morning she was asked how she had slept. "Oh, very badly," said the princess. "I scarcely closed my eyes all night. I'm sure I don't know what was in the bed. I lay on something so hard that my whole body is black and blue. It is dreadful." Now they perceived that she was a true princess, because she had felt the pea through the 20 mattresses and the 20 eider-down quilts. No one but a true princess could be so sensitive. So the prince married her, for now he knew that at last he had got hold of a true princess, and the pea was put into the Royal Museum, where it is still to be seen if no one has stolen it. Now this is a true story. End of section 69. Section 70 of Childhood's Favourites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christine Blashford. Childhood's Favourites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 70. The Sleeping Beauty. Once upon a time, long ago, so long indeed that even the very oldest people now alive could not remember it, there lived a king and queen in a beautiful palace, a great white marble palace with wide halls and high towers and a golden roof that flashed in the sun. And all around the palace, for miles and miles, there were lovely gardens and pleasure grounds, with terraces and green lawns, and ancient trees where the birds would sit and sing all day and all night long, and more flowers than you could ever think of if you were to think a whole summer through. There were peacocks and birds of paradise on the broad lawns, and pretty slender brown deer in the shady glades, and gold and silver fishes in the ponds and fountains, and great red and yellow fruits ripened in the orchards. There was everything there that heart could wish, except just one, and that was the one thing in all the world that this king and queen wanted to make them perfectly happy. For there was no little child to run and play about the sunny gardens, and pick the flowers and pet the birds and beasts that wandered there, and this would often make them very sad. But at last, after many years, they had their wish, and a little baby daughter was born to them, a tiny child with a face like a blush rosebud, eyes like violets, and a little red mouth like the pimpernel flowers that grow in the cornfields and by the wayside in summer-time. Now you can easily think how glad this king and queen were, and what great rejoicings were made over all the country. Bonfires as big as haystacks were kept burning all night, fat oxen were roasted whole in the market-place of every town, the church bells were rung and rung again until the ringers were out of breath and their arms were aching, and every little child in the kingdom was given a beautiful present for the baby princess's sake. In the palace, of course, all was bustle and hurry to make ready for the christening feast. The maids were busy putting flowers all about the halls and chambers, and sprinkling the shining floors with sweet-smelling leaves and petals. For the most important guests invited to this christening were 7 very powerful fairies, and you know, I am sure, how particular fairies are about what they eat and drink. Not that they are greedy, but they are used to such delicate food that even the very best of ours seems strange to them. So the queen was very anxious that they should be pleased, for they had been asked to be godmothers to the baby princess, and she wanted them to be in good humour, so that they should be kind to her little one. It was a beautiful summer afternoon, and the roses on the palace terrace were nodding their heads sleepily in the warm breeze, when the fairies' chariots came into sight, sailing through the blue sky like a flight of bright-winged butterflies. They were all good fairies, and had known the king and queen all their lives long, and as they had not seen them for some time, there was a great deal to talk about and much news to tell. And dear me, how pleased they were with the baby! They all agreed that she was the prettiest little darling they had ever seen, almost as pretty as a real fairy baby, and that was a compliment indeed, I can tell you. And when they went into the great banqueting hall and sat down to table, they were even more delighted than at first. For each one of them there was a set of 6 golden dinner things, knife, spoon, fork, cup, dish, and plate, made on purpose as a present for each, and all different. One was set with pearls, another with diamonds, the third with rubies, the fourth with opals, the fifth with amethysts, the sixth with emeralds, the seventh with sapphires, and nobody could tell which was the most beautiful. They were just going to begin, and everybody was as happy could be, when all of a sudden there was a clashing of brazen claws and a rushing of wings, and something like a black cloud seemed to pass before the tall windows and darken all the room so that the guests could hardly see their plates. Then the great doors burst open with a terrible bang, and an old fairy in a long trailing black gown, with her face almost hidden in a black hood, jumped out of a black chariot drawn by fierce griffins, and stalked up to the table. The king turned pale, and the queen nearly fainted away, for this was the spiteful fairy, Tormentilla, who lived all alone, an immense distance away from everywhere and everyone, in a dismal black stone castle in the middle of a desert. The poor queen had been so happy and so busy that she had forgotten all about her, and never sent her an invitation. However, they all tried to make the best of it, and another chair was brought, and another place laid for Tormentilla, and both the king and queen told her over and over again how very, very sorry they were not to have asked her. It was all in vain. Nothing could please her. She would eat and drink nothing, and she sat, scowling and looking angrily at the other fairies' jewelled cups and dishes, until the feast was over and it was time to give the presents. Then they all went into the great tapestried room where the tiny princess lay sleeping in her mother-of-pearl cradle, and the 7 fairies began to say what they would each give her. The first stepped forward and said, "She shall always be as good as gold." The second, "She shall be the cleverest princess in the world." The third, "She shall be the most beautiful." The fourth, "She shall be the happiest." The fifth, "She shall have the sweetest voice that was ever heard." The sixth, "Everyone shall love her." And then the wicked old cross fairy strode over to the cradle with long quick steps, and she said, shaking her black crooked stick at the king and queen, "And I say that she shall prick her hand with a spindle and die of the wound." At this, the queen fell on her knees and begged and prayed Tormentilla to call back her cruel words. But suddenly the seventh fairy, the youngest of all, who knew Tormentilla well and had hidden herself behind the curtains for fear that some such thing might happen, came out and said, "Do not cry so, dear queen. I cannot quite undo my cousin's wicked enchantment, but I can promise you that your daughter shall not die, but only fall asleep for 100 years. And when these are past and gone, a prince shall come and awaken her with a kiss." So the king and queen dried their tears and thanked the kind fairy Heartsease for her goodness, and all the fairies went back to their homes, and things went on much as usual in the palace. But you can imagine how careful the queen was of her little girl, and the king made a law that every spindle in the country must be destroyed, and that no more should be made, and that anyone who had a spindle should be heavily punished, if not executed at once. Well, the years went by happily enough, until the Princess Miranda was almost 18 years old, and all that the 6 fairies had promised came true, for she was the best and the prettiest and the cleverest princess in all the world, and everybody loved her. And indeed, by this time, Tormentilla's spiteful words were almost forgotten. "Poor old thing," the queen would sometimes say. She was so angry at having been left out that she did not know what she was saying. Of course, she did not really mean it. Now the king and queen had to go away for a few days to a great entertainment that one of their richest nobles was giving at his country house, and as the princess did not wish to go, they left her behind with her ladies-in-waiting in the beautiful old palace. For the first 2 days she amused herself very well, but on the third she missed her father and mother so much that to pass the time till they came back, she began exploring all the old lumber rooms and out-of-the-way attics in the palace, and laughing at the dusty furniture and queer curiosities she found there. At last she found herself at the top of a narrow winding stairway in a tall turret that seemed even older than all the rest of the palace, and when she lifted the latch of the door in front of her she saw a little low chamber with curiously painted walls, and there sat a little old woman in a high white cap spinning at a wheel. For some time she stood at the door watching the old woman curiously. She could not imagine what she was doing, for the princess had never seen a spinning wheel in her life before, because, as I told you, the king had ordered them all to be destroyed. Now it happened that the poor old woman who lived in this tower had never heard the king's command, for she was so deaf that if you shouted until you were hoarse, she would never have been able to understand you. "What pretty work are you doing there, Goody, and why does that wheel go whir, whir, whir?" said the princess. The old woman neither answered nor looked up, for, of course, she did not hear. So the princess stepped into the room and laid her hand upon the old woman's shoulder. Goody started then, looked up and rubbed her eyes. "Dearie, dearie me!" cried she in a high cracked voice. "And who may you be, my pretty darling?" "I'm the Princess Miranda!" screamed the maiden in her ear, but the old woman only shook her head. She could hear nothing. Then the princess pointed to the spindle and made the old woman understand that she wanted to try if she could work it. So Goody nodded and laughed and got up from her seat, and the princess sat down and took the spindle in her hand. But no sooner did she touch it than she pricked the palm of her hand with the point and sank down in a swoon. Immediately a deep silence fell on all around. The little bird that only a moment before had been singing so sweetly upon the window-sill hushed his song. The distant hum of voices from the courtyard beneath ceased. Even Goody stopped short in the direction she was giving the princess, and neither moved hand nor foot towards the poor little maid, and all because she had fallen fast asleep as she stood. Below in the castle it was just the same. The king and queen, who had that moment returned from their journey and were inquiring for their daughter, fell asleep before the lady-in-waiting could answer them, and as to the lady herself, she had begun to snore, in a ladylike manner, of course, before you could have winked your eye. The soldiers and men-at-arms slumbered as they stood. The page-boy fell asleep with his mouth wide open, and a fly that had just been going to settle on his nose fell asleep too in mid-air. Although the sun had been shining brightly when the princess took the spindle in her hand, no sooner did she prick herself with the point than deep shadows darkened the sunny rooms and gardens. It was just as though night had overtaken them, but there was no one in or near the palace to heed whether it were dark or light. This sudden darkness had been caused by a magic wood which had sprung up all around the palace and its grounds. It was at least 1/2 mile thick, and was composed of thorns and prickly plants, through which it seemed impossible for anyone to penetrate. It was so thick and high that it hid even the topmost towers of the enchanted castle, and no one outside could have dreamed that such a castle lay behind it. Well, and so the years went on and on and on, until 100 years had passed, and the palace and the story of it were all but forgotten. And it happened that a king's son from a neighbouring country came hunting that way with his men and horses and dogs, and in the excitement of the chase he rode on until he became separated from his servants and attendants, and found himself in a part of the country where he had never been before. In vain he tried to retrace his steps, he only seemed to wander farther away in the wrong direction. Presently he came to a woodcutter's cottage and dismounted to ask the way. An old man lived in this hut, and after he had directed the Prince as to the best way back, the young man pointed to a thick wood ahead and asked what lay beyond it. Then the old man told him that there was a legend that beyond the wood was an enchanted palace where a beautiful princess had lain sleeping for 100 years, and whom a prince was to awaken with a kiss. Directly the Prince Florimond heard this, nothing would serve but he must go there and see for himself if the tale were true. So he rode and he rode until he came to the edge of the wood, and there he got off his horse and began to push his way through the thorny thicket. It was hard work indeed, for the briars were so strong and so sharp that you would never believe that anyone could get past them, and they closed up behind him as he went. But he was strong and brave, and after a time the way became easier, until at last he came to the palace. There everyone was sleeping, the sentinels and soldiers in the courtyard, the cooks in the kitchen, and pages and lords and ladies in waiting in the corridors and chambers, and in the great throne room the king and queen on their golden and ivory thrones. Prince Florimond passed on, wondering more and more, till he came at length to the narrow staircase which led to the little tower in which the princess had fallen asleep. He mounted this, and then came the greatest wonder of all, the beautiful sleeping lady in her glistening white robes. She was so beautiful that to see her almost took away his breath, and falling on his knees he bent to kiss her cheek, and as he kissed her she opened her lovely blue eyes and said smiling, "Oh, Prince, have you come at last? I have had such pleasant dreams." Then she sat up laughing and rubbing her eyes, and gave him her hand, and they went hand in hand together down the stairs and along the corridors till they came to the throne room, and there were the king and queen rubbing their eyes too, and they kissed their daughter and welcomed the prince most gladly. And all at the same time the whole palace was awake. Cocks crowed, dogs barked, the cats began to mew, the spits to turn, the clocks to strike, the soldiers presented arms, the heralds blew their trumpets, the head cook boxed a little scullion's ears, the butler went on drinking his half-finished tankard of wine, the first lady in waiting finished winding her skein of silk. Everything, in short, went on exactly as though the spell had lasted 100 seconds instead of years. To be sure, Princess Miranda's pretty white dress was just such a one as Prince Florimond's great-grandmother might have worn, but that gave them something to laugh at. And now my story is done, for I need hardly tell you that the Prince and Princess were married amid great rejoicings, and lived happily ever after, and that the 7 fairy godmothers danced at the wedding. So all ended well, and what more could anyone wish? End of section 70.
Section 71 of Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Matt Bonehoff. Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 71. The Man in the Moon. Said the Raggedy Man on a hot afternoon, "My sakes, what a lot o' mistakes some little folks makes on the Man in the Moon. But people that's been up to see him like me, and calls on him frequent and intimately, might drop a few hints that would interest you, clean through, if you wanted 'em to, some actual facts that might interest you. Oh, the Man in the Moon has a crick in his back. Whee! Whim! Ain't you sorry for him? And a mole on his nose that is purple and black. And his eyes are so weak that they water and run. If he dares to dream even, he looks at the sun. So he just dreams of stars as the doctors advise. My eyes! But isn't he wise to just dream of stars as the doctors advise? And the Man in the Moon has a boil on his ear. Whee! Wing! What a singular thing! I know, but these facts are authentic, my dear. There's a boil on his ear and a corn on his chin. He calls it a dimple, but dimples stick in. Yet it might be a dimple turned over, you know. Wang! Ho! Why, certainly so. It might be a dimple turned over, you know. And the Man in the Moon has a rheumatic knee. Gee whiz, what a pity it is. And his toes have worked round where his heels ought to be. And whenever he wants to go north, he goes south, and comes back with the porridge crumbs all round his mouth, and he brushes them off with a Japanese fan. Wing! Wan! What a marvelous man! What a very remarkably marvelous man! And the man in the moon, sighed the Raggedy Man, gets so sullenson, you know, up there by himself since creation began, that when I call on him and then come away, he grabs me and holds me and begs me to stay, till when, if it wasn't for Jimmy come Jim, Dad, Lim, I go pardners with him, just jump my bob here and be pardners with him. End of section 71. The Man in the Moon. Recording by Matt Bonehoff.
Section 72 of Childhood Favorites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ralph Snelson. Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 72. Sage Counsel. The lion is the beast to fight. He leaps along the plain, and if you run with all your might, he runs with all his mane. I'm glad I'm not a Hottentot, but if I were with outward callum, I'd either faint upon the spot, or hie me up a leafy halum. The chamois is the beast to hunt. He's fleeter than the wind, and when the chamois is in front, the hunter is behind. The Tyrolese make famous cheese, and hunt the chamois o'er the chasms. I'd choose the former, if you please, for precipices give me spasms. The polar bear will make a rug almost as white as snow, but if he gets you in his hug, he rarely lets you go. And polar ice looks very nice, with all the colors of a prism, but if you'll follow my advice, stay home and learn your catechism. End of section 72.
Section 73 of Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Matt Bonehoff. Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 73. Limericks. There was an old man in a tree, who was horribly bored by a bee. When they said, "Does it buzz?" he replied, "Yes, it does. It's a regular brute of a bee." There was an old man on some rocks, who shut his wife up in a box. When she said, "Let me out," he exclaimed, "Without doubt, you will pass all your life in that box." There was an old man who said, "How shall I flee from this horrible cow? I will sit on this stile, and continue to smile, which may soften the heart of that cow." There was an old man who said, "Hush! I perceive a young bird in this bush." When they said, "Is it small?" he said, "No, not at all. It is 4 times as big as the bush." There was once an old man with a beard, who said, "It is just as I feared. 2 owls and a hen, 4 larks and a wren, have all built their nests in my beard." There was an old person of wear, who rode on the back of a bear. When they said, "Does it trot?" he said, "Certainly not. It's a mopsican flopsican bear." There was a young lady in blue, who said, "Is it you? Is it you?" When they said, "Yes, it is," she replied only, "Whiz!" That ungracious young lady in blue. End of section 73. Limericks. Recording by Matt Bonehoff.
Section 74 of Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Johnny J.T. Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 74. More Limericks. Number 1 by Rudyard Kipling. There was a small boy of Quebec who was buried in snow to his neck. When they said, "Are you friz?" he replied, "Yes, I is, but we don't call this cold in Quebec." Number 2 by Anonymous. There was a young lady of Niger who smiled as she rode on a tiger. They came back from the ride with the lady inside, and the smile on the face of the tiger. There was a young maid who said, "Why can't I look in my ear with my eye? If I give my mind to it, I'm sure I can do it. You never can tell till you try." End of section 74, More Limericks. This recording by Johnny J.T. is in the public domain.
Section 75 of Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Alana Jordan. Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 75. The Dead Doll. You needn't be trying to comfort me. I tell you my dolly is dead. There's no use in saying she isn't, with a crack like that in her head. It's just like you said it wouldn't hurt much to have my tooth out that day. And then, when the man most pulled my head off, you hadn't a word to say. And I guess you must think I'm a baby when you say you can mend it with glue. As if I didn't know better than that. Why, just suppose it was you. You might make her look all mended. What do I care for looks? Why, glue's for chairs and tables and toys and the backs of books. My dolly, my own little daughter. But oh, it's the awfulest crack. It just makes me sick to think of the sound when her poor head went whack against that horrible brass thing that holds up the little shelf. Now, Nursey, what makes you remind me? I know that I did it myself. I think you must be crazy. You'll get her another head? What good would 40 heads do her? I tell you my dolly is dead. And to think I hadn't quite finished her elegant new spring hat, and I took a ribbon of hers last night to tie on that horrid cat. When my mamma gave me that ribbon, I was playing out in the yard. She said to me most expressly, "Here's a ribbon for Hildegard." And I went and I put it on Tabby, and Hildegard saw me do it. But I said to myself, "Oh, never mind. I don't believe she knew it." But I know she knew it now, and I just believe I do, that her poor little heart was broken, and so her head broke too. Oh, my baby, my little baby, I wish my head had been hit, for I've hit it over and over, and it hasn't cracked a bit. But since the darling is dead, she'll want to be buried, of course. We will take my little wagon, Nurse, and you shall be the horse. And I'll walk behind and cry, and we'll put her in this, you see, this dear little box, and we'll bury her there, out under the maple tree. And Papa will make me a tombstone like the one he made for my bird, and he'll put what I tell him on it, yes, every single word. I shall say, 'Here lies Hildegard, a beautiful doll who is dead. She died of a broken heart and a dreadful crack in her head.'" Margaret Vandergrift. End of section 75. Recording by Alana Jordan, also known as Suburban Mom at YouTube.com.
Section 76 of Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kaylee K. Childhood's Favorite and Fairy Stories by various authors, Section 76. Little Things. Ascribed to Julia A. F. Carney. Little drops of water, little grains of sand, make the mighty ocean and the pleasant land. Thus the little moments, humble though they be, make the mighty ages of eternity. Thus our little errors lead the soul away from the path of virtue, off in sin to stray. Little deeds of kindness, little words of love, make our earth an Eden like the heaven above. End of section 76, Little Things. This recording read by Kaylee K is in the public domain.
Section 77 of Childhood Favorites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ralph Snelson. Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 77. The Golden Rule. To do to others as I would that they should do to me will make me gentle, kind, and good, as children ought to be. End of section 77.
Section 78 of Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 78. Do the best you can. If I was a cobbler, it should be my pride the best of all cobblers to be. If I was a tinker, no tinker beside should mend an old kettle like me. End of section 78. Section 79 of Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Voice of Spring. I am coming, hark, the little bee is humming. See, the lark is soaring high in the blue and sunny sky, and the gnats are on the wing, wheeling round in airy ring. See, the yellow catkins cover all the slender willows over, and on the banks of mossy green starlike primroses are seen, and their clustering leaves below white and purple violets grow. Hark, the newborn lambs are bleating, and the cawing rooks are meeting in the elms, a noisy crowd. All the birds are singing loud, and the first white butterfly in the sunshine dances by. Look around thee, look around, flowers in all the field abound. Every running stream is bright, all the orchard trees are white, and each small and waving shoot promises sweet flowers and fruit. End of section 79.
Section 80 of Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 80. The Lark and the Rook. Good night, Sir Rook, said a little lark. The daylight fades, it will soon be dark. I've bathed my wings in the sun's last rays. I've sung my hymn to the parting day. So now I haste to my quiet nook in yon dewy meadow. Good night, Sir Rook. Good night, poor lark, said his titled friend with a haughty toss and a distant bend. I also go to my rest profound, but not to sleep on the cold damp ground. The fittest place for a bird like me is the topmost bough of yon tall pine tree. I opened my eyes at peep of day, and saw you taking your upward way, dreaming your fond romantic dreams, an ugly speck in the sun's bright beams, soaring too high to be seen or heard, and I said to myself, what a foolish bird! I trod the park with a princely air, I filled my crop with the richest fare. I called all day mid a lordly crew, and I made more noise in the world than you. The sun shone forth on my ebon wing. I looked and wondered, good night, poor thing. Good night once more, said the lark's sweet voice. I see no cause to repent my choice. You built your nest in the lofty pine, but is your slumber more sweet than mine? You make more noise in the world than I, but whose is the sweeter minstrelsy? End of section 80.
Section 81 of Childhood Favorites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ralph Snelson. Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 81. Thanksgiving Day. Over the river and through the wood, to grandfather's house we go. The horse knows the way to carry the sleigh through the white and drifted snow. Over the river and through the wood, oh, how the wind does blow! It stings the toes and bites the nose as over the ground we go. Over the river and through the wood, to have a first-rate play. Hear the bells ring, ting-a-ling-ding, hurrah for Thanksgiving Day! Over the river and through the wood, trot fast, my dapple gray. Spring over the ground like a hunting hound, for this is Thanksgiving Day. Over the river and through the wood, and straight through the barnyard gate. We seem to go extremely slow, it is so hard to wait. Over the river and through the wood, now grandmother's cap I spy. Hurrah for the fun! Is the pudding done? Hurrah for the pumpkin pie! End of section 81.
Section 82 of Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Magpie's Nest, a fable. When the arts in their infancy were, in a fable of old it's expressed, a wise magpie constructed that rare little house for young birds called a nest. This was talk of the whole country round, you might hear it on every bough sung. Now no longer upon the rough ground will fond mothers brood over their young. For the magpie with exquisite skill has invented a moss-covered cell, within which a whole family will, in the utmost security, dwell. End of section 82, The Magpie's Nest. Recording by Ross Clement.
Section 83 of Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 83. The Fairies of the Caldon Low, A Midsummer Legend.
And where have you been, my Mary? And where have you been from me?
I have been to the top of the Caldon Low, the midsummer night to see.
And what did you see, my Mary, all up on the Caldon Low?
I saw the glad sunshine come down, and I saw the merry winds blow.
And what did you hear, my Mary, all up on the Caldon Hill?
I heard the drops of the water made, and the ears of green corn fill.
Oh, tell me all, my Mary, all that ever you know, for you must have seen the fairies last night on the Caldon Low.
Then take me on your knee, mother, and listen, mother of mine. 100 fairies danced last night, and the harpers they were 9. And their harp strings rung so merrily, to their dancing feet so small. But oh, the words of their talking were merrier far than all.
And what were the words, my Mary, that then you heard them say?
I'll tell you all, my mother, but let me have my way. Some of them played with the water, and rolled it down the hill. And this, they said, shall speedily turn the poor old miller's mill, for there has been no water ever since the 1st of May, and a busy man will the miller be at dawning of the day. Oh, the miller, how he will laugh when he sees the mill dam rise! The jolly old miller, how he will laugh till tears fill both his eyes! And some they seized the little winds that sounded over the hill, and each put a horn into his mouth and blew both loud and shrill. And there, they said, the merry winds go, away from every horn, and they shall clear the mildew dank from the blind old widow's corn. Oh, the poor blind widow, though she has been blind so long, she'll be blithe enough when the mildew's gone and the corn stands tall and strong. And some they brought the brown linseed and flung it down from the low. And this, they said, by sunrise in the weaver's croft shall grow. Oh, the poor lame weaver, how will he laugh outright when he sees his dwindling flax field all full of flowers by night? And then out spoke a brownie with a long beard on his chin. I have spun up all the tow, said he, and I want some more to spin. I've spun a piece of hempen cloth, and I want to spin another, a little sheet for Mary's bed, and an apron for her mother. With that I could not help but laugh, and I laughed out loud and free. And then on top of the Caldon Low there was no one left but me, and on the top of the Caldon Low the mists were cold and grey, and nothing I saw but the mossy stones that round about me lay. But coming down from the hilltop I heard afar below how busy the jolly miller was, and how the wheel did go. And I peeped into the widow's field, and sure enough were seen the yellow ears of the mildewed corn, all standing stout and green. And down by the weaver's croft I stole, to see if the flax were sprung, and I met the weaver at his gate, with the good news on his tongue. Now this is all I heard, mother, and all that I did see. So prithee make my bed, mother, for I'm tired as can be. By Mary Howitt. End of section 83.
Section 84 of Childhood's Favourites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Porrick. Childhood's Favourites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 84. The Land of Storybooks. At evening when the lamp is lit, around the fire my parents sit. They sit at home and talk and sing, and do not play at anything. Now with my little gun I crawl, all in the dark along the wall, and follow round the forest track, away behind the sofa back. There, in the night, where none can spy, all in my hunter's camp I lie, and play at books that I have read, till it is time to go to bed. These are the hills, these are the woods, these are my starry solitudes, and there the river by whose brink the roaring lions come to drink. I see the others far away, as if in firelit camp they lay, and I, like to an Indian scout, around their party prowled about. So, when my nurse comes in for me, home I return across the sea, and go to bed with backward looks at my dear land of storybooks. Robert Louis Stevenson. End of section 84. Recording by Porrick.
Section 85 of Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chris C. Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 85. A Visit from St. Nicholas. 'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. The stockings were hung by the chimney with care, in hopes that St. Nicholas soon would be there. The children were nestled all snug in their beds, while visions of sugar plums danced in their heads. And Mamma in her kerchief, and I in my cap, had just settled our brains for a long winter's nap. When out on the lawn there arose such a clatter, I sprang from my bed to see what was the matter. Away to the window I flew like a flash, tore open the shutters, and threw up the sash. The moon on the breast of the new-fallen snow gave a lustre of midday to objects below. When what to my wondering eyes should appear but a miniature sleigh and 8 tiny reindeer, with a little old driver so lively and quick, I knew in a moment it must be St. Nick. More rapid than eagles his coursers they came, and he whistled and shouted and called them by name. Now Dasher, now Dancer, now Prancer and Vixen, on Comet, on Cupid, on Donder and Blitzen, to the top of the porch, to the top of the wall, now dash away, dash away, dash away all. As dry leaves that before the wild hurricane fly, when they meet with an obstacle, mount to the sky, so up to the housetop the coursers they flew, with a sleigh full of toys, and St. Nicholas too. And then in a twinkling I heard on the roof the prancing and pawing of each little hoof. As I drew in my head and was turning around, down the chimney St. Nicholas came with a bound. He was dressed all in fur from his head to his foot, and his clothes were all tarnished with ashes and soot. A bundle of toys he had flung on his back, and he looked like a peddler just opening his pack. His eyes, how they twinkled, his dimples, how merry, his cheeks were like roses, his nose like a cherry, his droll little mouth was drawn up like a bow, and the beard on his chin was as white as the snow. The stump of a pipe he held tight in his teeth, and the smoke it encircled his head like a wreath. He had a broad face and a little round belly that shook when he laughed like a bowl full of jelly. He was chubby and plump, a right jolly old elf, and I laughed when I saw him, in spite of myself. A wink of his eye and a twist of his head soon gave me to know I had nothing to dread. He spoke not a word, but went straight to his work, and filled all the stockings, then turned with a jerk, and laying his finger aside of his nose, and giving a nod, up the chimney he rose. He sprang to his sleigh, to his team gave a whistle, and away they all flew like the down of a thistle. But I heard him exclaim ere he drove out of sight, "Happy Christmas to all, and to all a good night." Clement Clarke Moore. End of section 85.
Section 86 of Childhood Favorites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ralph Snelson. Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 86. Little Orphan Annie. Little Orphan Annie's come to our house to stay, and wash the cups and saucers up, and brush the crumbs away, and shoo the chickens off the porch, and dust the hearth and sweep, and make the fire, and bake the bread, and earn her board and keep. And all us other children, when the supper things is done, we sit around the kitchen fire and has the mostest fun, a-listening to the witch tales that Annie tells about, and the goblins that get you, if you don't watch out. Once they was a little boy wouldn't say his prayers, so when he went to bed at night, away upstairs, his mammy heard him holler, and his daddy heard him bawl, and when they turned the kivers down, he wasn't there at all. And they seeked him in the rafter room, and cubby-hole, and press, and seeked him up the chimley flue, and everywheres, I guess, but all they ever found was this his pants and roundabout, and the goblins'll get you if you don't watch out. And one time a little girl 'ud allus laugh and grin, and make fun of everyone, and all her blood and kin. And once, when they was company and old folks was there, she mocked 'em and shocked 'em, and said she didn't care. And this as she kicked her heels and turned to run and hide, they was two great big black things a-standin' by her side, and they snatched her through the ceiling, for she knowed what she's about, and the goblins'll get you if you don't watch out. And little orphan Annie says, when the blaze is blue, and the lamp wick sputters, and the wind goes woo, and you hear the crickets quit, and the moon is gray, and the lightnin' bugs in dew is all squenched away, you better mind your parents, and your teachers fond and dear, and cherish them 'at loves you, and dry the orphan's tear, and help the poor and needy ones that clusters all about, or the goblins'll get you if you don't watch out. End of section 86. Section 87 of Childhood Favorites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ralph Snelson. Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 87. The Chatterbox. From morning to night 'twas Lucy's delight to chatter and talk without stopping. There was not a day but she rattled away like water forever a-dropping. As soon as she rose, whilst she put on her clothes, 'twas vain to endeavor to still her, nor once did she lack to continue her clack, till again she lay down on her pillow. You'll think now, perhaps, there would have been gaps if she hadn't been wonderful clever, that her sense was so great and so witty her pate, that it would be forthcoming forever. But that's quite absurd, for have you not heard, much tongue and few brains are connected, that they are supposed to think least who talk most, and their wisdom is always suspected. While Lucy was young, had she bridled her tongue with a little good sense and exertion, who knows but she might have been our delight, instead of our jest and aversion. End of section 87.
Section 88 of Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ruth Golding. Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 88. The Voice of Spring. I come, I come. Ye have called me long. I come o'er the mountains with light and song. Ye may trace my step o'er the waking earth by the winds which tell of the violet's birth, by the primrose stars in the shadowy grass, by the green leaves opening as I pass. I have breathed on the south, and the chestnut flowers by thousands have burst from the forest bowers, and the ancient graves and the fallen fanes are veiled with wreaths on Italian plains. But it is not for me, in my hour of bloom, to speak of the ruin or the tomb. I have looked o'er the hills of the stormy north, and the larch has hung all his tassels forth. The fisher is out on the sunny sea, and the reindeer bounds o'er the pastures free. And the pine has a fringe of softer green, and the moss looks bright where my step has been. I have sent through the wood paths a glowing sigh, and called out each voice of the deep blue sky, from the night bird's lay through the starry time, in the groves of the soft Hesperian clime, to the swan's wild note by the Iceland lakes, when the dark fir branch into verdure breaks. From the streams and founts I have loosed the chain, they are sweeping on to the silvery main, they are flashing down from the mountain brows, they are flinging spray o'er the forest boughs, they are bursting fresh from their sparry caves, and the earth resounds with the joy of waves. Felicia Dorothea Hemans. End of section 88. Recording by Ruth Golding.
Section 89 of Childhood Favorites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ralph Snelson. Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 89. The History Lesson. There was a monkey climbed up a tree. When he fell down, then down fell he. There was a crow sat on a stone. When he was gone, then there was none. There was an old wife did eat an apple. When she had eat two, she had eat a couple. There was a horse going to the mill. When he went on, he stood not still. There was a butcher cut his thumb. When it did bleed, then blood did come. There was a lackey ran a race. When he ran fast, he ran apace. There was a cobbler clouting shoon. When they were mended, they were done. There was a chandler making candle. When he them strip, he did them handle. There was a navy went into Spain. When it returned, it came again. End of section 89.
Section 90 of Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Carolyn Francis. Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 90. Song of Life by Charles Mackay. A traveler on a dusty road strewed acorns on the lea, and one took root and sprouted up and grew into a tree. Love sought its shade at evening time to breathe its early vows, and age was pleased in heights of noon to bask beneath its boughs. The dormouse loved its dangling twigs, the bird sweet music bore. It stood a glory in its place, a blessing evermore. A little spring had lost its way amid the grass and fern. A passing stranger scooped a well where weary men might turn. He walled it in, and hung with care a ladle on the brink. He thought not of the deed he did, but judged that toil might drink. He passed again, and lo, the well, by summer never dried, had cooled 10,000 parched tongues, and saved a life beside. A nameless man, amid the crowd that thronged the daily mart, let fall a word of hope and love, unstudied from the heart. A whisper on the tumult thrown, a transitory breath. It raised a brother from the dust, it saved a soul from death. O germ, O font, O word of love, O thought at random cast, ye were but little at the first, but mighty at the last. End of section 90.
Section 91 of Childhood Favorites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ralph Snelson. Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 91. The Good Time Coming. There's a good time coming, boys, a good time coming. We may not live to see the day, but earth shall glisten in the ray of the good time coming. Cannon balls may aid the truth, but thought's a weapon stronger. We'll win our battle by its aid. Wait a little longer. There's a good time coming, boys, a good time coming. The pen shall supersede the sword, and right, not might, shall be the lord in the good time coming. Worth, not birth, shall rule mankind and be acknowledged stronger. The proper impulse has been given. Wait a little longer. There's a good time coming, boys, a good time coming. War in all men's eyes shall be a monster of iniquity in the good time coming. Nations shall not quarrel then to prove which is the stronger, nor slaughter men for glory's sake. Wait a little longer. There's a good time coming, boys, a good time coming. Hateful rivalries of creed shall not make their martyrs bleed in the good time coming. Religion shall be shorn of pride, and flourish all the stronger. And charity shall trim her lamp. Wait a little longer. There's a good time coming, boys, a good time coming. And a poor man's family shall not be his misery in the good time coming. Every child shall be a help to make his right arm stronger. The happier he, the more he has. Wait a little longer. There's a good time coming, boys, a good time coming. Little children shall not toil under or above the soil in the good time coming. But you'll play in healthful fields till limbs and mind grow stronger. And everyone shall read and write. Wait a little longer. There's a good time coming, boys, a good time coming. The people shall be temperate and shall love instead of hate in the good time coming. They shall use and not abuse, and make all virtue stronger. The Reformation has begun. Wait a little longer. There's a good time coming, boys, a good time coming. Let us aid it all we can, every woman, every man, the good time coming. Smallest helps, if rightly given, make the impulse stronger. 'Twill be strong enough one day. Wait a little longer. End of section 91.
Section 92 of Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Vera and Real. Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Windy nights. Whenever the moon and stars are set, whenever the wind is high, all night long in the dark and wet, a man goes riding by. Late at night when the fires are out, why does he gallop and gallop about? Whenever the trees are crying aloud and ships are tossed at sea, by on the highway low and now, by at the gallop goes he. By at the gallop he goes, and then by he comes back at the gallop again. End of Windy Nights.
Section 93 of Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Carolyn Francis. Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 93. The Wonderful World by William Bridie Rands. Great, wide, beautiful, wonderful world, with the wonderful water round you curled, and the wonderful grass upon your breast, world, you are beautifully dressed. The wonderful air is over me, and the wonderful wind is shaking the tree. It walks on the water and whirls the mills, and talks to itself on the top of the hills. You friendly earth, how far do you go, with the wheat fields that nod and the rivers that flow, with cities and gardens and cliffs and isles, and people upon you for thousands of miles? Ah, you are so great, and I am so small. I hardly can think of you, world, at all. And yet, when I said my prayers today, my mother kissed me and said quite gay, "If the wonderful world is great to you, and great to father and mother too, you are more than the earth, though you are such a dot. You can love and think, and the earth cannot." End of section 93.
Section 94 of Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chris C. Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 94. Hark, hark, the lark. Hark, hark, the lark at heaven's gate sings, and Phoebus begins arise, his steeds to water at those springs unchaliced flowers that lies, and winking merry buds begin to ope their golden eyes. With everything that pretty been, my lady's sweet, arise, arise, arise. William Shakespeare. End of section 94. Section 95 of Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chris C. Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 95. Jog on, jog on. Jog on, the footpath way, and merrily hent the stile, a merry heart goes all the day, your sad tires in a mile, William Shakespeare. End of section 95. Section 96, Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chris C. Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 96. Sweet Story of Old. I think when I read that sweet story of old, when Jesus was here among men, how he called little children as lambs to his fold, I should like to have been with them then. I wish that his hands had been placed on my head, that his arm had been thrown around me, and that I might have seen his kind look when he said, "Look, the little ones come unto me." Yet still to his footstool in prayer I may go, and ask for a share in his love. And if I thus earnestly seek him below, I shall see him and hear him above. In that beautiful place he has gone to prepare for all who are washed and forgiven, and many dear children shall be with him there, for of such is the kingdom of heaven. But thousands and thousands who wander and fall never heard of that heavenly home. I wish they could know there is room for them all, and that Jesus had bid them to come. Jemima Luke. End of section 96. Section 97, Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chris C. Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories by various authors, Section 97. My shadow. I have a little shadow that goes in and out with me, and what can be the use of him is more than I can see. He is very, very like me from the heels up to the head, and I see him jump before me when I jump into my bed. The funniest thing about him is the way he likes to grow, not at all like proper children, which is always very slow. For he sometimes shoots up taller like an India rubber ball, and he sometimes gets so little that there's none of him at all. He hasn't got a notion of how children ought to play, and can only make a fool of me in every sort of way. He stays so close beside me, he's a coward you can see. I'd think shame to stick to Nursey as that shadow sticks to me. One morning very early, before the sun was up, I rose and found the shining dew on every buttercup. But my lazy little shadow, like an errant sleepyhead, had stayed at home behind me, and was fast asleep in bed. Robert Louis Stevenson. End of section 97. Section 98. Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chris C. Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories by various authors, Section 98. By Cool Silem's Shady Rill. By cool Silem's shady rill, how sweet the lily grows, how sweet the breath beneath the hill of Sharon's dewy rose. Lo, such the child whose early feet the paths of peace have trod, whose secret heart, with influence sweet, is upward drawn to God. By cool Silem's shady rill the lily must decay. The rose that blooms beneath the hill must shortly fade away, and soon, too soon, the wintry hour of man's maturer age will shake the soul with sorrow's power and stormy passion's rage. O thou, whose infant feet were found within thy father's shrine, whose years with changeless virtue crowned were all alike divine, dependent on thy bounteous breath, we seek thy grace alone, in childhood, manhood, age, and death, to keep us still thine own. Reginald Herbert. End of section 98. Section 99. Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chris C. Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories by various authors, Section 99. The Wind in a Frock. The wind one morning sprang up from sleep, saying, "Now for a frolic, now for a leap, now for a madcap galloping chase. I'll make a commotion in every place." So it swept with a bustle right through a great town, creaking the signs and scattering down shutters and whisking with merciless squalls old women's bonnets and gingerbread stalls. There never was heard a much lustier shout as the apples and oranges tumbled about, and the urchins that stand with their thievish eyes forever on watch ran off each with a prize. Then away to the fields it went blustering and humming, and the cattle all wondered whatever was coming. It plucked by their tails the grave matronly cows, and tossed and the colts' manes all about their brows, till offended at such a familiar salute, they all turned their backs and stood silently mute. So on it went, capering and playing its pranks, whistling with reeds on the broad river banks, puffing the birds as they sat on the spray, or a traveller grave on the king's highway. It was not too nice to bustle the bags of the beggar and flutter his dirty rags. 'Twas so bold that it feared not to play its joke with the doctor's wig and the gentleman's cloak. Through the forest it roared and cried gaily, "Now, you sturdy old oaks, I'll make you bow." And it made them bow without more ado, or it cracked their great branches through and through. Then it rushed like a monster o'er cottage and farm, striking their inmates with sudden alarm, and they ran out like bees in a midsummer's swarm. There were dames with their kerchiefs tied over their caps to see if their poultry were free from mishaps. The turkeys they gobbled, the geese screamed aloud, and the hens crept to roost in a terrified crowd. There was rearing of ladders and logs laying on, where the thatch from the roof threatened soon to be gone. But the wind had passed on, and had met in a lane with a schoolboy who panted and struggled in vain. For it tossed him and twirled him, then passed, and he stood with his hat in a pool and his shoe in the mud. William Howitt. End of section 99. Section 100, Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chris C. Childhood's Favorites and Fairy Stories by various authors. Section 100, The Graves of a Household. They grew in beauty side by side, they filled one home with glee. Their graves are severed far and wide by mount and stream and sea. The same fond mother bent at night o'er each fair sleeping brow. She had each folded flower in sight. Where are those sleepers now? One midst the forest of the west by a dark stream is laid. The Indian knows his place of rest, far in the cedar shade. The sea, the blue lone sea, hath one. He lies where pearls lie deep. He was the loved of all, yet none o'er his low bed may weep. One sleeps where southern vines are dressed above the noble slain. He wrapped the colors round his breast on a blood-red field of Spain. And one, o'er her the myrtle showers its leaves by soft winds fanned. She faded midst Italian flowers, the last of that fair band. And parted thus they rest who played beneath the same green tree, whose voices mingled as they prayed around one parent knee. They that with smiles lit up the hall and cheered with song the hearth. Alas, for love, if thou wert all, and naught beyond, O earth. Felicia Dorothea Hemans. End of section 100.